Thank you very much, Vera, for the opportunity. Important questions there, but I would like to go first to why we're here and the context that is important. In the last 75 years, we've made the argument about multilateral reform. Somebody has not heard that argument. And the question is, why in 75 years you've made the argument and you're trying to make it in the next 30 years? Maybe nobody will hear. Maybe the context in which we're making the argument is not being pressed enough. We're making it in the context of, either increases, small reforms. I say no, let's step back. Let's go back to the foundation of Bretton Woods. This is multilateral fundamentalism. In 1945, we established the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF. Why? Because we did not want another Adolf Hitler, and we did not want global wars. So we launched a phase where we strengthened democracy and we entered the Cold War. That was then. 75 years after that, not even 75, 44 years after that, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell and communism collapsed. In those 44 years, China lifted 600 million people out of poverty. China was the last preserve of a communist country. In those same years, Africa put millions of people into poverty. You're standing at 1989, China lifting people out of poverty, and Africa having more people in poverty. Beyond 1989 to now, China moved more people out of poverty. South Korea received $2.5 billion, which the World Bank gave to all countries in 1950. That funding enabled South Korea to become an economic miracle. Africa has never been treated as a geostrategic interest for the global multilateral system. So when you come to your question of capacity, business environment, then we look at Africa. Oh, the capacity is weak. They don't have he was talking about infrastructure. McKinsey wrote a report that says there are two issues with infrastructure in Africa. They need more money, but then there is the money where only 10% of the funding reaches financial close. So you don't have more money, but of the money you're having, 10% of the infrastructure projects are reaching financial close. Who's solving that problem? That's why we set up the International Finance Corporation and the World Bank to deal with those big challenges. Do you know that the World Bank before 1960 was involved only with large infrastructure projects? It shifted to social sector since then. Was that change necessary? Or do we go back to the old World Bank? The question is, to answer these questions, you have to look at this broader context. Because as we speak right now, Africa needs $2.4 trillion between 2010 and 2020 and 2030 for climate finance. You were talking about IDA of 93 million. Now put that scale together. IDA 93 million, 2.4 trillion. Africa needs 100 billion to close the infrastructure gap. So you have to present to the G7 and to the multilateral community that the reforms we're talking about here are not sclerotic small pieces. We have to go back to 1945. Africa, the Cold War that we succeeded in, right, the Soviet Union collapse, came at the expense of Africa. That is what the G7 has to believe, that we paid the price. Between 1945 and now, the West destroyed the climate, and Africa is needing $2.5 trillion to restore itself. Look at that inequity and that imbalance. When you present the argument in that way, then people say, well, we go back to the foundation of multilateral fundamentalism. Then increasing IDA becomes a matter of urgency. And so the context is important as the argument of how we reform the bank rules, ending poverty and sharing prosperity. How do you end poverty? Do you end poverty by the bank going to do social protection? Or do you end poverty by closing the infrastructure gap so that companies can move and provide jobs for people in Africa? It's a strategy. Which strategy are you pursuing? That has to be at the bottom line of rethinking the whole system. Other than that, we have tactical gains as we've had. Either we move from 93, it'll go 20%, 30% up. That's a tactical gain. What you need is a strategic, geostrategic approach to look at this. Now, coming specifically to your question about capacity, yes. The argument is that do countries have the absorptive capacity? That's a legitimate argument. But what do we do to enable countries to get the absorptive capacity? So I just made an example from McKinsey study. They're saying countries cannot absorb the infrastructure flows because projects are failing. They can't do bankable projects. They're not able to pipeline. So that's the big problem there. They're losing 80%. How do we sit with countries to achieve that? That's why we have a private sector wing at the World Bank. That's why we have IFC. What is IFC doing along with the bank to resolve the capacity issues? All right? So countries will continue to struggle. The excuse will be, well, they don't have the absorptive capacity. Either, in my constituency in the World Bank, for example, I think we have around 25 billion of unspent IDA, even though all countries need more money. We're looking for more IDA resources, and countries are not moving, are not disbursing enough. What is the reason? Some of it is bank rule, some of it is country rule. Let's bring that to this holistic table and have the conversation. Liberia is a green economy. Liberia has received no support from the international community for its greenness. How can we be serious? So right now, the other day, the president encouraged us to sign into a 50 billion pact with the UAE. UAE is establishing a 50 billion fund. They said, look, you are too green. We want to do our development. We want to leverage your greenness, and so we want to pipeline some projects so that at least we'll be able to give you 500 million or 1 billion to do your infrastructure, because the West has already developed, and maybe UAE wants to go to the West, so they will pollute, and we will help them pollute because we have the forest. That is the conversation of the Paris conversation. But where are we going with that? So, Farah, this is an exciting, interesting conversation to have here at the margins of the World Bank, but I think we have to be serious.